So you might think of a worldview as trying to stuff all of reality into one box. Right? So the materialist is the box of matter. It's never big enough to explain all of reality. You can be absolutely certain. This is what I love about this approach. You know, as a Christian, I have tried to stay intellectually honest and open to objections, right? And to the idea that maybe someday I would run into objection I couldn't answer. Maybe I would someday run into some form of thought that I really couldn't respond to. And you know, I think as a Christian, you need to stay open to that possibility. After writing Finding Truth, I know I never will, because it is totally logical. Something is going to stick out of their box. Right? If you have a box, it will never be big enough, and something will always stick out. Something will not fit into your box. Of course, if you admit that, you've just admitted that your philosophy doesn't work, that your categories are too limited to account for all of reality, so you don't admit it. You take whatever doesn't fit in your box, and you say, well, it's not real. It's an illusion. There's the reductionism. So reductionism is simply a way of denying whatever doesn't fit into your box. So materialism, for example, says humans are biochemical machines and just reduces everything else to an illusion. Now, the next two questions are how do you test a worldview? How do you test any idea? This is really common sense. These are the questions that you ask when you are in a courtroom, when you're in the science lab, or when your kid is explaining why he didn't do his homework. What are the two basic questions that you ask to test any idea? Yeah, what's your evidence? Does it fit the real world? Does it fit the facts of the real world? And yeah, you got them both. And is it logically coherent? Does it hold together? Does it hold together logically? Now let's look at the external test. Does it fit the real world? And we're going to see something really fascinating here. Many prominent thinkers today actually admit that their philosophy does not fit the real world. And I want you to see this in their own words. Galen Strawson is a British philosopher who says humans are essentially machines, robots. Sorry, I forgot this slide was here. Here's why. Here's why materialists lead, again, why they end up with a contradiction between the philosophy and the real world. If you begin with matter, operating by blind mechanical forces, then logically humans cannot ultimately be anything but complex mechanisms, right? Your starting assumptions limit the categories available to you. This is really hard, by the way, when you're talking to really secular people. They keep wanting to import some level of intelligence or thought or free will into matter. I'm having a discussion right now with a very, very committed gay activist, and he's saying, well, I'm a materialist, but he wants to somehow incorporate mind or consciousness in matter. And I keep telling him, you know, if you start with atoms bumping on in the void, you don't have mind or consciousness unless you're a panpsychist. And he says, what is that? That's a different perspective. But anyway, I keep trying to press him back and help him to see whatever you start with limits the categories available to you if you're going to be logically consistent. So let's look at Strawson. Galen Strawson says, okay, he starts with the claim that the impossibility of free will can be proved with complete certainty, right? Because it's logically the only possible outcome. But does that fit the real world? In an interview, he says, I can't really live with this fact from day to day. Can you, really? So watch for phrases like that. We can't really live with it. These are clues that the person is struggling with the evidence from the created order, from the experience of his own humanity, like Romans says. His humanity is giving him evidence for God, and it doesn't fit his philosophy. You can't, how do you test a worldview? In scientific theory, you take it into the lab and see whether the chemicals really react the way the theory says they should. A worldview you test by taking it into the real world and seeing if you can live it out consistently without doing violence to human nature. So Galen Strawson goes on and says, it seems that we cannot live or experience our choices as determined, even if determinism is true. The most powerful logical or metaphysical reasons for denying free will come up against equally powerful psychological reasons why we can't help believing that we do have it. Watch for phrases like that. We can't live with it. We can't help believing it. And by the way, you'll notice that many of the debates today still focus on free will. And why is that? I used to think, well, that's just one part of human nature. Why be so limited? It turns out free will is the basis for virtually all the distinctively human features. Think of what you couldn't have if you didn't have free will. What else could you not have? Love. Yeah, robots don't love, right? Choice, moral responsibility, moral choice. So free will has become sort of a stand-in. When you hear these philosophers talk about free will, that's become a sort of stand-in for all of these distinctively human traits. Okay, another example. Marvin Minsky at MIT is best known for his punchy phrase that the human brain is nothing but a 3-pound computer made of meat. Now, computers have no free will, right? Mine doesn't. So the implication is, neither do we. That's his reductionism. Okay, some of you think yours does. It seems pretty obstinate at times. Okay, but then he says we cannot live with that implication. He writes, no matter that the physical world provides no room for freedom of will, that concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. We cannot ever give it up. Thus, we're virtually forced to maintain that belief, even though we know it's false. False, that is, according to his materialist worldview. This is a serious case of cognitive dissonance. So when a concept like free will keeps bubbling up inescapably, irresistibly, unavoidably, even in the mind of someone whose worldview tells them it's false, that means they're bumping up against the truths of the created order, of general revelation. They're trying to suppress the evidence of those truths, according to Romans 1. Why? Because the evidence that we are someone and not a something means our origin has to be a someone. Now, what do they do with these truths they cannot ignore, but that don't fit their worldview? Essentially, they compartmentalize their minds. They create a dualism or a dichotomy. Philosophers sometimes illustrate with a metaphor of 2 stories in a building, so that materialists put matter and energy in the lower story, and they say, well, that's real, that's objective, that's true, that's scientific. And the upper story becomes a kind of attic where they toss everything that does not fit in their materialist box: free will, mind, morality, spirit, God, and so on. If you were here last night, does this remind you of anything? See, in Love Thy Body, I show how this division is playing out in the moral issues. It becomes a body versus person dualism. But you see, it's because it's coming from the scientists. The scientists are creating the dualism, and ethicists are essentially applying whatever the scientists tell them is true. See, the problem is that these concepts are contradictory. If we really are robots operating by purely material causes, then freedom is impossible. There's no logically consistent, unified worldview that can encompass both of these statements. It's not like body and soul in the biblical concept, where they are complementary. This is an irresolvable contradiction, and that's why it is a true dichotomy. Leading thinkers today have accepted a fractured, fragmented, compartmentalized, internally contradictory 2-story worldview. So they say Christianity is irrational, but this is irrational. When I teach these concepts in the classroom, the examples my students always remember best is Rodney Brooks, also at MIT. By the way, notice that these are prominent thinkers. These are not fringe people. That's why I mentioned that when they're from MIT, Harvard, so on. Brooks was the head of the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. And he wrote a book where he says the human being is nothing but a big bag of skin full of biomolecules. interacting by the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, in ordinary life, he says, I realize it's hard to see people this way. But when I look at my children, I can, when I force myself, see that they are machines. Is that how he actually treats them? Of course not. That's not how I treat them. I interact with them on an entirely different level. They have my unconditional love. And then he admits that love has no rational analysis within his own materialist worldview. It sticks out of the box. It doesn't fit his materialist box. So how does he resolve this contradiction? He doesn't even try. Here's how he ends that paragraph. He says, I maintain two sets of inconsistent beliefs. You see the two-story dualism there? This is really the tragedy of the modern age. The things that have been reduced to useful fictions, the things that we know are false, are the things that matter most in life, the things that are necessary for a humane society. Things like freedom, moral ideals, human dignity, and even loving your own children. Now, why would anyone want to accept such an inhumane view, something so contrary to their own personal experience? If humans can be reduced to machines operating by purely natural forces, then their origin can be purely natural forces. Let me give you one final example. This is Edward Slingerland. He's a materialist and an evolutionist. And he's interesting because he's not a scientist. This is for you creative types, those of you who are in literature and so on. He's written a book as a literary person saying, okay, even we artists need to accept what the scientists say. So he's written a book saying we have to accept the materialism, the evolutionism. And he too says free will is an illusion. But it's an illusion we can't seem to shake. He says no one can help acting like, and at some level really feeling, that he or she is free. In fact, we are robots designed not to believe we are robots. Do you like that word, designed? Now, you would think Slingerland would take this as a contradiction, as a falsification of his worldview. He's admitting that it fails to fit his own experience. But watch this move. He says we must cultivate a dual consciousness, striving to view human beings simultaneously under two descriptions, as physical systems and as persons. So what's he doing? He's intentionally setting up this dichotomy, physical systems versus persons. Now, apparently the contradiction hits home the hardest when it hits home, because he too finds his philosophy the hardest to live with when it comes to his children. So he says evolution tells us humans are just biochemical robots programmed for evolutionary survival. But the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me. Such extreme reductionism inspires in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. In fact, he says, if you don't feel that revulsion, something's wrong with you. There may be individuals who can quite easily conceive of themselves and other people in purely instrumental, mechanistic terms. But we label such persons psychopaths and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. So what can we say when someone urges us to adopt a view that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant, that ought to inspire revulsion, that would justify us in locking people up if they actually believed it? This is severe cognitive dissonance. He is being pressed to the point of decision. Will he acknowledge the evidence from the created order, that his daughter is a personal being and gives evidence of a personal creator? Or will he cling to his materialist beliefs in the face of the evidence? Now, the strength of this approach to apologetics is it shows why worldviews fail on their own terms. It's not very effective to criticize someone else's view from within your perspective, because that just means they disagree with you. Instead, Christians must step inside the other person's perspective and show that it fails to account for reality as they themselves experience it.